The hardest thing for me has been the fix of that decision for the last 5 years. The fact that I still haven't had a risk management board assessment done for me over the last 5 years. Everybody else within this group of people get it at the minimum once a year.
A secret report just destroyed everything. Harry's inheritance, frozen. Meghan's past, exposed. And the one document Diana hid for 30 years has finally been opened. Palace staff are in absolute panic. William just confirmed what nobody wanted to believe. King Charles made a decision so extreme it hasn't been done in 200 years. The royal family as we know it might be over.
Because I'm from the States, you don't grow up with the same understanding of the royal family, and so while I now understand very clearly there's a global interest there, I didn't know much about him, and so the only thing that I had asked her when she said she wanted to set us up was, I had one question. I said, well, is he nice?
What they're hiding about Meghan will shake you to your core. You need to see this before it's taken down. The decision to freeze the inheritance was not made hastily or in response to tabloid speculation. According to sources close to the royal household, this action stems from a carefully considered legal process that involves long-standing provisions within Princess Diana's estate planning documents. The suspension affects all distributions from the trust that had been designated for the Duke of Sussex and his immediate family members. What makes this situation particularly notable is the mechanism through which it was triggered. Deep within the legal framework of Diana's trust exists a clause that has remained dormant for nearly 3 decades. This provision was specifically designed to address questions of lineage and biological descent. The clause itself is not concerned with personal conduct, public relations, or family disputes. Instead, it focuses solely on establishing clear and verifiable lines of descent from Princess Diana through her sons. Senior officials at Clarence House quietly approved the suspension in the early hours of January 17th, 2026. The timing suggests that this was a coordinated response to emerging information rather than a spontaneous decision. Palace legal advisors had reportedly been reviewing the relevant documentation for several weeks prior to the announcement, ensuring that every procedural requirement was properly satisfied before taking such a dramatic step. The activation of this clause represents a first in royal history. Never before has a provision of this nature been enforced within the modern British monarchy. Legal experts familiar with estate planning have noted that while such clauses are not uncommon in high-value trusts, their actual enforcement is extremely rare. The fact that the palace chose to proceed indicates that the circumstances met a very specific and stringent set of criteria outlined in the original trust documents. Prince William, in his capacity as a senior member of the royal family and someone with direct knowledge of his mother's wishes, played a crucial role in authorizing this action. A statement released under his authority emphasized that the suspension was implemented as a precautionary measure. The language used was careful and precise, making clear that this was not intended as a punitive action against Prince Harry or anyone else. Rather, it was described as a necessary step to protect the integrity of the estate and ensure that Diana's clearly expressed wishes were being honored. The statement further clarified that the suspension would remain in place until certain matters could be fully resolved. These matters pertain to questions that have emerged regarding the eligibility of beneficiaries under the specific terms that Princess Diana herself established when creating the trust. The palace has been notably careful not to elaborate on the exact nature of these questions, citing both legal confidentiality and respect for the privacy of individuals involved. What the clause actually requires is biological and legal clarity. It does not make judgments about character, lifestyle choices, or family dynamics. Its singular purpose is to ensure that inheritance flows only to individuals whose descent from Princess Diana can be established beyond reasonable doubt. This reflects a level of foresight on Diana's part that many royal observers find remarkable, particularly given that she created these provisions during a period of significant personal and institutional turmoil in the mid-1990s. The trust structure itself is complex, as is typical for estates of this magnitude and sensitivity. Diana worked with top legal advisors to create a framework that would protect her sons while also accounting for various contingencies that might arise in the future. At the time these documents were drafted, some of the provisions seemed overly cautious or even unnecessary. The current situation has proven that Diana's concerns were not unfounded. For Prince Harry, the immediate practical impact is significant. The inheritance in question represents a substantial portion of the financial legacy left to him by his mother. While he has other sources of income and has built a life independent of royal funding, the suspension nonetheless represents both a financial concern and a deeply personal matter. The inheritance from Diana has always carried emotional weight beyond its monetary value, representing a tangible connection to a mother he lost at a young age. The palace has been at pains to emphasize that this action follows established legal procedures rather than representing any form of family punishment. Royal sources have indicated that every step taken has been in strict accordance with both the letter and spirit of Diana's documented wishes. The trust was created with specific safeguards for precisely this type of situation, and those safeguards are now being applied as Diana intended them to be. The broader implications for the royal family are substantial. This situation touches on fundamental questions about how the monarchy manages succession, transparency, and the protection of its most important legacies. In an institution where precedent and tradition carry enormous weight, the activation of a previously unused legal mechanism sends a clear signal about the seriousness with which these matters are being treated. Legal observers have noted that the clause's existence and its current enforcement highlight the degree to which Princess Diana understood both the legal system and the unique pressures her sons might face in the future. She created these provisions during a time when she was increasingly concerned about the transparency and integrity of royal processes. Her decision to include such specific language about lineage verification suggests she anticipated scenarios that might require absolute clarity about family connections. The freeze transforms what might otherwise be viewed as a private family matter into something with lasting institutional significance. It demonstrates that even in cases involving beloved public figures and their descendants, the monarchy is prepared to enforce the legal frameworks that govern inheritance and succession. This adherence to established procedures, even when they create uncomfortable situations, is presented by the palace as evidence of the institution's commitment to operating within clear legal boundaries. As the situation continues to develop, attention has shifted to how it will ultimately be resolved. The suspension is not permanent by design. Rather, it creates a pause that allows for proper verification and documentation. Once the questions that triggered the clause have been adequately addressed, the trust can resume normal operations. However, the timeline for such resolution remains unclear, and the specific steps required have not been publicly disclosed. The announcement has inevitably generated intense public interest and speculation. However, palace officials have been consistent in their messaging that this is fundamentally a legal matter being handled through appropriate channels. They have discouraged attempts to frame it as a family feud or personal vendetta, instead emphasizing the procedural nature of the action and its grounding in Diana's own documented wishes from decades ago. The mechanism that enabled the suspension of Prince Harry's inheritance traces back to a specific legal provision that has existed within Princess Diana's trust, documents since the mid-1990s. This provision, commonly referred to as Clause 3 among palace legal advisors, was designed with a singular and very precise purpose. Unlike other clauses that might govern the timing of distributions or establish conditions based on age or achievement, Clause 3 addresses something far more fundamental to the nature of inheritance itself. The clause was created to restrict access to trust funds in situations where questions arise regarding biological descent from Princess Diana through her sons. Its language is technical and unambiguous, leaving little room for interpretation or discretion. The provision does not evaluate behavior, assess worthiness, or make judgments about family relationships. Instead, it establishes a straightforward requirement that biological lineage must be clearly and conclusively verified when specific circumstances trigger the need for such verification. For nearly 3 decades, Clause 3 remained largely theoretical. Palace. Lawyers were aware of its existence, but it was generally regarded as an extreme contingency rather than something likely to be invoked. Many legal experts who reviewed the trust over the years viewed it as an example of overly cautious planning, the kind of provision that gets included to address remote possibilities but never actually comes into play. The fact that it has now been activated marks a significant turning point in how Diana's foresight is understood. Royal archivists who have access to the historical documentation surrounding the creation of Diana's trust have confirmed that she personally insisted on including this clause. This was not a suggestion from her legal team or a standard provision that lawyers routinely insert into high-value estates. Diana specifically requested language that would address concerns about lineage verification, and she was apparently quite clear about wanting this safeguard in place. The timing of when Diana made this request is significant. The trust was finalized during a period in the mid-1990s when her relationship with the royal institution had become increasingly strained. She had grown skeptical of palace systems and processes, yet her instincts as a mother remained sharp and focused on protecting her sons' futures. According to those familiar with her thinking at the time, Diana was particularly concerned that her youngest son might someday find himself in a vulnerable position. Her fears were not driven by any specific incident or accusation. Rather, they stemmed from a more general apprehension about how silence and secrecy can create complications that become more difficult to address as time passes. Diana reportedly worried that unanswered questions, if allowed to persist long enough, could eventually cause problems even without anyone acting with malicious intent. She understood that truth, when withheld or unclear, could become a source of confusion and conflict. When her legal advisors finalized the trust documents, they categorized Clause 3 as an expression of maternal concern. It was seen as an understandable request from a mother operating under extraordinary circumstances and immense pressure. The lawyers who drafted the language made sure it was legally sound and enforceable, but they apparently did not expect it would ever need to be used. The assumption was that it would remain a footnote in the trust documents, present but inactive. That assumption has now been proven incorrect. By choosing to trigger Clause 3, Prince William has effectively transformed what was once viewed as his mother's private anxiety into an active legal mechanism. The trust no longer treats the provision as symbolic or precautionary in an abstract sense. Instead, it now operates as Diana intended, creating a formal requirement for verification before inheritance can proceed. The clause itself does not make accusations or assumptions about wrongdoing. Its function is procedural rather than punitive. It perhamel simply establishes a pause, a legal hold that remains in effect until specific conditions are satisfied. During this pause, the inheritance remains untouched and inaccessible. No distributions can be made, no funds can be transferred, and no assumptions about entitlement can be acted upon. Everything stops until clarity is achieved. This procedural nature is important to understand. The freeze is not designed to punish anyone or to express disapproval. It is a mechanism for ensuring that the trust operates according to Diana's specifications. When those specifications require verification of lineage, the trust must comply before it can continue functioning normally. The personal feelings of family members, the opinions of the public, or the pressures of media attention are all irrelevant to how the clause operates. The legal framework that allowed Diana to create such a provision is rooted in principles of English law that give individuals considerable freedom in determining how their estates will be distributed after death. This concept, known as testamentary freedom, is a cornerstone of inheritance law in England and Wales. It permits people to make decisions about their property and wealth with relatively few restrictions, allowing personal judgment and specific concerns to shape the structure of trusts and wills. Under English law, Diana had the right to decide exactly who would inherit her wealth, under what circumstances, and according to what terms. She could establish conditions, impose requirements, or create delays if she believed such measures were necessary. The law placed very few limits on these choices, recognizing that individuals should have broad authority over their own property even after death. This stands in contrast to legal systems in other parts of the United Kingdom and in many other countries, where close family members may have guaranteed rights to portions of an estate regardless of the deceased person's wishes. In Scotland, for example, the law provides automatic protections for certain family members, ensuring they receive a share of the estate even if the deceased's will attempts to exclude them. England and Wales offer no such mandatory provisions. Instead, a properly executed will reflect the intentions of its maker with very little interference from the state or the courts. This gives individuals like Diana substantial power to shape their legacies according to their own values and concerns. For Diana, this legal freedom meant that her estate was more than just a collection of financial assets to be divided among heirs. It was a tool that she could design carefully to protect her intentions long after she was gone. She could anticipate potential problems, identify areas of uncertainty, and create mechanisms to address those issues if they ever arose. The law gave her the authority to be proactive rather than simply reactive. Because of this legal reality, Diana was entirely within her rights to build safeguards, like Clause 3, into her trust. These were not emotional gestures or vague warnings expressed in symbolic language. They were concrete legal mechanisms, drafted with precision and designed to function in specific situations. She could require proof of various facts, demand verification of relationships, or pause distributions if certain conditions were not met. None of this pushed against the boundaries of what the law permitted. In fact, it was a straightforward exercise of the authority that English law grants to anyone creating a trust or will. Many trusts include provisions that delay inheritance until beneficiaries reach a certain age, complete specific educational requirements, or satisfy other defined criteria. These kinds of conditions are entirely routine and legally uncontroversial. Diana's decision to focus on lineage verification was unusual only in its specific subject matter, not in the underlying legal principle. The law fully permits grantors to condition inheritance on her verification of biological relationships, especially in cases involving substantial wealth or complex family situations. What distinguishes Clause 3 from more common trust provisions is not its legality, but its underlying purpose. Diana clearly understood that wealth and inheritance can complicate lives rather than simplify them. She believed that passing on an inheritance should be grounded in certainty rather than assumption. The clause was designed to create space for clarity before access, ensuring that what was distributed rested on a foundation of verified truth rather than convenient presumptions. Far from being imposed by others, Clause 3 was entirely Diana's initiative. It reflected her sophisticated understanding of both the legal system and the unique challenges her sons might face. She was not reckless with the freedom the law provided. Instead, she was deliberate and careful. Every condition she established was placed with thought. Every requirement was chosen to protect, rather than to create obstacles. The precision of the language and the clarity of the intent demonstrate that Diana approached this task with both legal understanding and maternal concern. In the end, Clause 3 represents the natural outcome of a woman exercising her legal rights fully and thoughtfully. English law gave Diana the power to shape her legacy according to her own judgment, and she used that power with intention and foresight. The clause was not extraordinary from a legal standpoint. It was simply the result of someone who understood the system and chose to use it wisely to protect what mattered most to her. The situation that ultimately led to the activation of Clause 3 was not triggered by palace insiders, media investigations, or family disputes. Instead, it began with the arrival of a person who had previously played no role in royal affairs or public discussion. This individual, identified in legal documents only by the initials AM to protect privacy, stepped forward with claims that immediately drew the attention of palace legal advisors and set in motion a chain of events that would prove impossible to ignore. AM, a 29-year-old American woman, presented herself in a manner that was notably measured and deliberate. There was no dramatic press conference, no sensational media appearance, and no attempt to leverage public attention for personal gain. Instead, she approached the situation through formal legal channels, working with attorneys and presenting documentation in a way that suggested careful preparation rather than impulsive revelation. Her approach was methodical, and this restraint made her claims more difficult to dismiss outright. At the center of her assertions was a claim of biological connection to Meghan Markle. AM stated that she was born in July 1996, a date that placed her arrival at a very specific moment in time. This timing was significant because it predated Meghan's entry into public life by more than a decade and occurred during a period when Meghan was a young adult, navigating the transition between adolescence and adulthood. The specificity of the date and the clarity with which AM presented her timeline suggested that this was not a vague or uncertain claim. What made AM's appearance particularly compelling from a legal standpoint was the nature of the evidence she brought with her. She arrived with sworn statements that had been properly notarized and witnessed. She presented documentation that had been organized chronologically and cross-referenced for consistency. Most significantly, she provided DNA test results that she claimed demonstrated a maternal biological link to the Markle family line. According to the documentation she submitted, these tests had been conducted by an internationally recognized geneticist and showed what was described as a 99% probability of a maternal match. The quality and presentation of this evidence distinguished AM's claim from the kind of assertions that public figures routinely face. Palace legal advisors, who are trained to evaluate the credibility of various claims and to distinguish between frivolous allegations and matters requiring serious attention, apparently concluded that the documentation warranted further examination. The tests had been conducted according to established scientific protocols, the chain of custody for samples appeared to have been properly maintained, and the credentials of the laboratory and geneticist involved were verified as legitimate. Perhaps even more notable than the evidence itself was what AM did not request. She made no demands for money, titles, or any form of material compensation. She did not seek public recognition or a formal place within any family structure. There were no requests for inheritance rights, no claims to royal connections, and no attempts to leverage her assertion for financial or social advantage. According to those familiar with her communications, her stated objectives were remarkably narrow and specific. AM indicated that her primary concerns were acknowledgement and access to accurate medical history. She expressed interest in understanding her biological background for health-related reasons, as knowledge of genetic heritage can be important for medical decision-making and preventive care. She also spoke about the personal importance of knowing one's origins and having clarity about family history. These motivations, focused on truth and health rather than wealth or status, gave her claim a different character than what palace officials typically encounter. This restraint in her demands significantly affected how her claims were received. Palace legal advisors could not easily categorize her as opportunistic or motivated by personal gain. The absence of financial requests or attempts to insert herself into public life suggested that her motivations might indeed be what she claimed them to be: a desire for clarity and truth. This made the situation more complex from an institutional perspective, as it could not be simply dismissed as an attempt at exploitation. The timing of AM's emergence proved to be particularly significant. Her arrival coincided with a period when palace officials were conducting routine but unusually thorough reviews of various royal trusts and inheritance arrangements. These reviews are conducted periodically to ensure that all legal requirements are being properly observed and that documentation remains current and accurate. The fact that AM stepped forward during such a review meant that her claims immediately intersected with existing legal processes. Once AM made her assertions and presented her documentation, the situation crossed a threshold that made it impossible for palace officials to simply file the information away and continue as before. Questions that had been purely theoretical suddenly became immediate and concrete. The mechanisms that Diana had put in place decades earlier, mechanisms designed to activate in precisely this kind of situation, were no longer abstract provisions in legal documents. They became relevant and operational. As palace legal teams began to examine the implications of AM's claims, investigators also started looking into Meghan Markle's personal history from the period in question. This investigation was not conducted with media fanfare or public announcements. Instead, it proceeded quietly through official channels, with legal professionals reviewing whatever documentation could be obtained through legitimate means. What emerged from this investigation was a timeline that raised additional questions. Researchers uncovered references to a relationship that Meghan had allegedly been involved in during the mid-1990s with an individual named Joe Giuliano. While the existence of past relationships is not inherently significant, certain details surrounding this particular connection attracted attention from legal investigators. Specifically, there were indications that the relationship may have included a formal engagement and possibly even a brief marriage conducted under Catholic auspices. The investigation uncovered references to documentation that had been submitted to Catholic authorities regarding an annulment request. Annulment processes within the Catholic Church are highly structured and involve detailed record-keeping. Unlike divorce, which dissolves a valid marriage, annulment is a declaration that a valid marriage never existed in the first place, according to church law. The process requires thorough documentation and examination of the circumstances surrounding the relationship in question. Within the records associated with this alleged annulment request, investigators found references to an unbaptized child. This detail, if accurate, carried both emotional and procedural significance. From a procedural standpoint, the mention of a child in annulment documentation is standard practice, as the Church must account for any offspring when making determinations about the validity of marriages. The fact that such a reference existed suggested that at the time the annulment was sought, there was acknowledgement of a child connected to the relationship. Vatican archivists working within the boundaries of what church privacy rules permit confirmed that sealed annulment records do exist in their archives, though they could not and would not disclose specific details about their contents. The mere existence of such records, however, provided investigators with a documentary trail that could potentially be examined through appropriate legal channels if necessary. These records, once dismissed as rumor or misinterpretation, were now being reconsidered as potentially relevant documentation. The significance of this information was not primarily moral or personal. Palace investigators were not making judgments about private choices or past relationships. Instead, their concern was procedural and legal. Protocols require thorough disclosure during various processes, including background vetting, immigration filings related to marriage to a royal family member, and preparations for formal roles within the institution. The comprehensiveness of these disclosures is taken seriously because incomplete information can affect legal determinations and institutional decisions. If past marriages, children, or binding religious commitments existed but were not disclosed during relevant processes, this would represent a procedural matter regardless of the reasons for the omission. The royal system operates on the assumption that all relevant historical information is provided during appropriate stages of vetting and approval. This allows decisions to be made with full knowledge of relevant facts. When information later emerges that was not previously disclosed, it raises questions about the completeness of earlier processes. The distinction between intentional deception and inadvertent omission is less important from a procedural standpoint than might be assumed. The royal legal framework treats gaps in disclosure seriously, regardless of the motivation behind them. The system is designed to function on the basis of complete information, and anything less introduces uncertainty into institutions that are built on clarity and documented fact. As investigators continued examining the timeline and available documentation, the implications began to extend beyond simply understanding the past. Questions arose about how incomplete earlier disclosures might affect current legal standings, particularly in matters related to lineage, titles, and inheritance rights. The Sussex line, which had been established through Harry and Meghan's marriage and the births of their children, suddenly appeared potentially subject to procedural review depending on what further investigation might reveal. What troubled palace officials most was not necessarily what the investigation was proving, but rather what had not been examined before. The chronology suggested that important information might exist that had never been properly reviewed or verified through official channels. Historical details that might have seemed personally private at the time they occurred could now have institutional relevance. And once such questions were formally raised within the palace legal system, there was no mechanism for simply setting them aside without proper resolution. As the situation surrounding the inheritance freeze continued to develop, the response from both the royal institution and external parties began to take concrete form. The palace moved with characteristic precision, implementing measures that reflected both caution and institutional self-protection. These actions were not announced with fanfare or detailed public explanations, but they were nonetheless systematic and comprehensive in scope. Prince William, acting in his capacity as a senior royal and future monarch, authorized the suspension of references and projects that had formal connections to the Sussex branch of the family. This was not executed as a dramatic severing of ties, but rather as a quiet administrative adjustment. Official royal communications began to omit mentions that had previously been routine. Collaborative initiatives that had involved both working royals and the Sussexes were either concluded or restructured to proceed without the California-based couple's participation. Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, took steps to ensure that charitable engagements previously associated with both the Sussexes and other family members were reconfigured. Organizations that had benefited from joint patronages or combined appearances found themselves navigating new arrangements. The changes were implemented smoothly from an operational standpoint, with palace staff working behind the scenes to ensure that charitable work continued without interruption, even as the formal associations were modified. Princess Catherine adopted a posture that palace observers described as deliberate discretion. Her public appearances continued according to schedule, but her communications became notably more measured. There were no public comments about the situation, no indirect references that might fuel speculation, and no gestures that could be interpreted as taking sides in what was clearly a complex family matter. Her silence, carefully maintained and consistently applied, communicated more effectively than any statement could have. It signaled that the institution was maintaining unity and focus despite internal challenges. The overall effect of these coordinated actions was to create what insiders privately called a legacy lockdown. This was not a punitive isolation imposed out of anger or revenge, but rather a protective measure designed to insulate the core functions of the monarchy from uncertainty and controversy. Every financial asset, every formal connection, and every official reference that linked the working royals to the Sussex household was reviewed and, where appropriate, suspended or terminated. The machinery of the monarchy continued to operate, but it did so along pathways that no longer intersected with Harry and Meghan's activities. Across the Atlantic, a different but parallel process of distancing began to unfold. Meghan Markle's network of professional relationships and industry connections, which had once seemed robust and supportive, began to show signs of fragmentation. This did not happen suddenly or with public announcements. Instead, it occurred through a series of quiet withdrawals and subtle repositioning by key figures in the entertainment industry. Tyler Perry, who had been one of Meghan and Harry's most visible supporters and had even provided them with accommodation during their initial period in California, stepped back from collaborative projects. The withdrawal was handled professionally, without public statements or explanations, but industry observers noted the shift. Other high-profile contacts and potential partners similarly began to create distance, some citing scheduling conflicts, others offering vague explanations about strategic priorities or creative direction. Projects that had been in various stages of development with production companies and streaming platforms encountered unexpected delays. Initiatives that had seemed promising began to stall without clear explanation. Media platforms that had shown interest in content involving or produced by the Sussexes quietly shelved plans or allowed options to expire without renewal. The cumulative effect of these individual decisions was a gradual but unmistakable contraction of professional opportunities. What had initially been presented by the Sussexes and their representatives as a bold assertion of independence now began to resemble something closer to isolation. The narrative of building a new life on their own terms, free from royal constraints, had depended on maintaining strong connections within the entertainment industry and broader cultural sphere. As those connections weakened, the foundation of that independence appeared less stable than it had seemed. In both contexts, the royal institution in Britain and the entertainment industry in America, the approach to distancing followed similar patterns. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public denunciations, and no theatrical gestures. Instead, doors simply closed, access was quietly restricted, and channels that had been open became unavailable. The process was professional and measured, but it was also final. Once these institutional and professional relationships were restructured or terminated, there was no casual path back to previous arrangements. Legal strategy became paramount as the situation evolved. Initially, the choice to maintain relative public silence had served as a protective measure, allowing legal processes to proceed without the complications that public commentary often introduces. However, as time passed, that silence began to carry different implications. Without proactive communication or gestures toward reconciliation, the absence of the Sussexes from public discourse created space for speculation and allowed uncertainty to take root. Within the palace, the approach remained fundamentally defensive but highly disciplined. The priority was to maintain institutional continuity, enforce established protocols without exception, and prevent any distractions from the core functions of the monarchy. Every decision was made with an eye toward precedent and procedure, ensuring that actions could be justified through reference to established rules rather than personal feelings or family dynamics. In California, the situation presented different challenges. The entertainment industry operates on principles of visibility and momentum. Success in that environment depends on maintaining relationships, generating publicity, and demonstrating ongoing relevance. The absence of active projects and the withdrawal of key supporters created a vacuum that became increasingly difficult to fill. Without allies championing their work or platforms eager to collaborate, the Sussexes found themselves operating with diminishing leverage. The contrast between these two spheres became increasingly apparent. The monarchy, with its centuries of institutional practice and established protocols, could weather controversy by simply adhering to its structures and waiting for resolution. The entertainment world, by contrast, is far more dynamic and less forgiving of periods of inactivity or negative attention. Influence in Hollywood depends on perception and relationships, both of which can shift rapidly when circumstances change. As January progressed, the tension between these different environments reached what many observers considered a critical point. Prince Harry, who had been navigating the situation from California while maintaining whatever contact with family members remained possible, made the decision to return to the United Kingdom. His departure from Montecito was handled quietly, without the media attention that often accompanies royal movements. He travelled with minimal entourage, carrying primarily documents and correspondence. Among the papers Harry brought with him was a copy of his mother's final will, a document that had suddenly become more relevant than at any point since her death. The will represented not just financial provisions, but also Diana's intentions and concerns for her son's futures. It contained the language of Clause 3 and all the other carefully constructed provisions she had put in place to protect her legacy and her children. Inside Buckingham Palace, preparations were made for what was expected to be a series of difficult conversations and legal consultations. King Charles, facing a situation that required both paternal concern and institutional responsibility, prepared to exercise legal powers that are rarely invoked. These powers, embedded in the structures that govern royal inheritance and succession, allowed the monarch to halt recognition of descendants when serious questions about lineage remained unresolved. The mechanisms Charles prepared to use had existed for generations, but had seldom been necessary. Their very existence reflected the monarchy's long-standing awareness that questions of descent and legitimacy could arise, and that the institution needed tools to address such situations when they occurred. The rarity of their use did not diminish their legal force. When activated, these provisions carried the full weight of royal authority and legal precedent. Paul Burrell, Diana's former butler, and one of the few people who had maintained her confidence during the most difficult periods of her life, was contacted by palace officials. He had preserved various items and documents from his years of service, including correspondence that Diana had entrusted to him. Among these materials was a sealed letter, one that Diana had written with specific instructions about when and how it should be delivered. The time for that delivery had apparently arrived. The letter, written in Diana's distinctive hand, spoke directly to the situation her youngest son now faced. With the benefit of hindsight, her words seemed almost prophetic. She had anticipated a moment when Harry would be caught between competing loyalties, when love and duty would pull in different directions, and when choices would need to be made that could not satisfy everyone involved. Her counsel, preserved for decades, was now directly relevant to the crisis at hand. On the evening of January the 18th, King Charles addressed the nation in a carefully prepared statement. His words were measured and delivered without emotional excess. There was no attempt to dramatize the situation or to assign blame to any particular individual. Instead, he spoke about the principles that guide the monarchy, the importance of clarity in matters of succession and inheritance, and the necessity of adhering to established legal frameworks even when doing so creates personal difficulty. The king's central message was straightforward and uncompromising. Inheritance from royal trusts could not proceed without proper verification. Restoration of suspended benefits and recognitions could not occur without certainty about the facts. The speech lasted only a few minutes, but its implications resonated far beyond the immediate situation. It served as a reminder that the monarchy's survival depends not on the desires of individual members, but on consistent application of law and tradition. As the palace lights dimmed that evening, staff members and officials who had worked through the day's extraordinary events exchanged quiet observations about what had transpired. Among the comments that circulated, one phrase seemed to capture the painful reality of the moment. Sometimes, to protect the institution of the crown, difficult decisions must be made regarding individual princes. It was not stated with satisfaction or triumph, but rather with the recognition that duty and personal loyalty do not always align. The reckoning that had been building for weeks had now fully arrived, leaving all involved to navigate consequences that would extend well into the future.